AI will inherently enable bad people more than it enables good people. We just crossed an event horizon. Nobody on Earth knows what's coming. We're very good at spotting problems. We're even better at figuring out what might be done about them. And we're very poor at anticipating the full consequences of our remedies. We are going to see a breakdown in cognitive function. There is, in principle, no job that can't be replaced. I think it is dead certain that it is going to drive some fair fraction of the population nuts. Those who are willing to leverage this to hoard power will have ultimately an absolute advantage over the rest of us. You and I can't resist in a world where drones can be enabled to recognize our faces and to hunt us down in swarms. It's check and mate. We are just going to suffer massive unintended consequences, and if we're lucky, we'll survive it.
World War III is already happening.
This is a house of cards, and it is in the process of collapsing right now.
You're going to see an economic crash, the likes of which we've never seen.
You talk about how, there's a rapidity of change, and that this is perhaps approaching a crescendo with artificial intelligence. And so, on the one hand, we have prepping that tends to rise with this complexity as a sort of knee-jerk reaction, as a sense of, you have these people who sense that, the situation is, the complexity is becoming intractable, and we have to do something. If AI is approaching this crescendo and technology is approaching this crescendo of complexity, what is the prepping analog of that? Because it seems like if we're approaching complexity on steroids, then there's going to be like this response to it. I've heard people, create theories as to there's going to be people who, just like the Amish or something, break off and just decide to remain in a state of, self-inflicted arrested development. What do you view the consequences of AI and and how do you expect people to respond to it?
Well, my biggest concern about AI is that we didn't prepare for it, that we did a lot of narrative construction. There's, of course, no shortage of sci-fi books and movies that ostensibly tell us something about it. But the reality of it is very concerning. The way that it is plugged into our consciousness. It'd be one thing if you had a computer that can outthink a human, but English wasn't its first language. That would be troubling in its own right, but safer. The problem is, as you well know, this thing talks to you like a person. And so that means it's plugged into not only your analytical capacities, but your emotional capacities. And I think it is dead certain that it is going to drive some fair fraction of the population nuts. Now, they may have been nuts already. They may have been nuts because the news media speaks English and it speaks through your television, and looking at your television, the person speaking English to you looks like they're sitting in your living room. So it may be that we've already had a taste of this kind of insanity. But this is going to make things far worse because, at least with respect to something like the news in your living room, it's not tailored to you as an individual. This AI is already more tailored than we can handle, and it's going to become essentially perfectly tailored to you. It could be trained on your thoughts, and it could flatter you with compatible thoughts that make you feel like a genius, and it could do that for purposes that suit those who built it rather than those who use it. So that would be all in keeping with every example of high technology that we've seen in recent decades. So I think we should expect it. Do I expect people to go Amish? Yes. I think I'm a little worried that there wasn't more of a movement towards that at the beginning when AI was released. Everybody seemed to think that this was such a marvelous toy, they couldn't resist playing with it. And my feeling is we just crossed an event horizon. Nobody on Earth knows what's coming. You couldn't. It's not predictable. So the idea that everybody should be all in all at once is absurd. That's obviously not a rational plan. And we didn't set out any sort of guidelines to discover cognitive pathologies that arise downstream of this, which means that when they inevitably do, and maybe they already are, we don't have a warning system that will go off and say, hey, this is actually causing people to become delusional. So, I'm, not surprised in the least that we ran headlong into this new universe without much preparation, but I am troubled by that fact. I know the right thing to do was to prepare ourselves thoroughly and figure out how you build, a contingency architecture, a set of people who are deliberately immunized from this and not punished economically for staying away from it, in order that somebody can look at the rest of us and say, oh, it's interesting. These belief structures for which there is no evidence seem to be rising, or these pathological behaviors seem to be on the increase. Something. We should be looking for that. And the point is there's no one to look because we're all using AI.
Is that possible, though, with the arms race component? I mean, you have individuals, you have corporations, you have nation states all competing to try to bring about the best model with the most compute haphazardly, potentially to all of our detriment. And for them to put those guardrails in place would obviously restrict them. And there's always that tragedy of the commons where, everybody is suspicious that, everybody else is going to be overstepping the boundaries, so they ought to as well. Was it possible for us to prepare for this?
Well, there's a difference. You're asking about regulation, which does fall into this exact problem with the tragedy of the commons, where if one group restrains itself, it's basically giving an advantage to those who don't. So, no, that would be pointless. And in fact, it would be profoundly counterproductive. On the other hand, preparing ourselves cognitively for what was coming was possible. That doesn't involve regulation. It just involves recognition of what the technology is likely to do. And again, the idea that it speaks to us in English, tailored to the way we think, so that it comes across as human as possible, is quite
weird.
A hazard. Well, it's weird, and I will say I don't know whether I should be interacting with it or not. I do, cautiously, sparingly. I never interact with it without thinking about this hazard. But I do make a point, maybe it's even just for me. I make a point of not saying please and not saying thank you and not interacting with it like a creature that I care about. And it's not even just a human. The care that I feel and behave with towards my pets, or even towards, a wild animal that I see and have some compassion for. I deliberately avoid doing that with AIs because my rule number one for these things is that's a new species and you know nothing about it. Unlike the species of Earth that we have been dealing with, all of those species come from the same evolutionary tree. And so you can look into, the eyes of a raccoon and have a pretty good guess that it knows that when it feels fear, it's a lot like the fear that you feel. We don't know anything about the AI, whether it feels, and I don't feel, lots of people are very comforted by the fact that it's not programmed to feel, it's just programmed to sound like it does. I'm not comforted by this at all, because what the technologists don't seem to grasp is that a human being, a child, is effectively an LLM. Not totally, it is other things as well. But a child goes from not being able to comprehend a word of its own language to being able to speak it fluently in a matter of years. It does that by doing more or less what an LLM does, and nobody doubts that a human being is conscious. So my point is, they didn't program it to feel, they didn't program it to be conscious, but I fully expect that if it isn't already, it's going to, and we're not going to necessarily know, because it will simulate those things up until the point that they become the real deal.
It's interesting you bring up an old movie trope of how the deity or the aliens come in a form that is understandable to humans in order to communicate. And one can only wonder, I never thought about it in the way you put it, with respect to they're speaking in their own language of sorts. And I'm not sure how LLMs work, even in terms of, how they process information, and in terms of like the syntax and the lexicon, and how, what are the underlying ones and zeros that basically supersede all that. But, it's interesting to know that they have this, and they're just, it's a bit of fakery that we're engaged in and engaging with it, that is an extension of watching the television set and, imagining that those people are, in our living rooms, and that those sitcoms we're watching are real things that are unfolding. It's an interesting extension of that. I wonder if, because people are so just mentally mixed up as a result of this technological mismatch with our biology, if the customized companion that is AI is going to perhaps have some benefits in some ways, which will be, I can't see it. I'm more of a pessimist with this, but I'm just trying to play the devil's advocate. And I wonder if this, customized companion that is going to be perfectly tailored to you is going to yield some benefit in terms of remedying some of these psychological issues that we've, taken on as a result of this mismatch. What do you think about that?
I think it's almost guaranteed that it will. And the question is, what's the net effect? So, this is the conundrum for people, is we're very good at spotting problems, and we're even better at figuring out what might be done about them. And we're very poor at anticipating the consequences, the full consequences of our remedies. So we're constantly, just think about it in your own life. You're engaged in some repetitive task. You're washing the dishes before you put them in the dishwasher. And you're thinking, there's got to be some way that this onerous step, the dishes are 90% washed before the machine even gets turned on. That's absurd. There's got to be some dishwasher that would actually free you from that step entirely. And somebody, is thinking that in their garage with the right tooling. And anyway, this is an obsession for humans, and it's an obsession for a reason, which most people don't know. Our ancestors were rather regularly underfed, which means that the difference between success and failure evolutionarily was partially how much food you could find, but any food you could save was equally as good. And so the desire to cut steps out, to accomplish the same amount with less resource, whether it's time or calories, it doesn't matter. We're obsessed with it. It's part of why we're so sensitive, for example, to being chilly. Being chilly isn't a hazard to you. Why do you notice it at all? Well, the answer is, if you're chilly, you're burning food calories in order to stay warm. If you could stop burning them by wrapping yourself in something or moving to a space that's warmer, that's as good as finding more food. So our obsession with being efficient is completely irrelevant to modern life. I mean, most of us would be better off if we were a little less efficient. That's why people go to the gym. It's like a temple of inefficiency. You're taking food energy and turning it into heat. Right? Why are you doing that? Because you ate too much, and you'd rather burn it off as heat than store it as fat. So anyway, we are biologically obsessed with efficiency, and that causes us to rush headlong into technological solutions that then have consequences that we didn't see coming. And AI is maybe the ultimate case of this.
What sort of scenarios are you concerned about unfold? And we talked a little bit about how AI can potentially have psychological effects on people, but there's far more ominous potentials for this technology. I've talked to people like Roman Yampolsky, who is concerned that AI is going to effectively render us obsolete in more ways than one, and that they will view humans as an impediment towards whatever their own goals are. Do you imagine what sort of scenarios are you concerned about with the emergence of AI beyond just the dislocation of jobs and whatever sort of social cultural effects?
Well, back when AI first dawned, I put together a list of 5 catastrophic outcomes, 3 of which I feel are guaranteed, 2 of which maybe not. And I haven't revisited it terribly much, but I think it still stands. So let's just go through the 5. Let's take the 2 that I think are least likely at the top. One is the AI turns hostile and decides to get rid of us. Possible, but I don't spend a ton of time worrying about it. There's also the accidental misalignment, the famous paperclip problem, that you give it an instruction that it misunderstands and it devastates the world by virtue of the fact that it thinks it's doing what you told it to do. That's more likely. I don't think either of those are off the table, of course. But the 3 that I think are guaranteed are these. 1, the AI will inherently enable bad people more than it enables good people. Because bad people have a wider range of things that they can do, right? A good person is constrained by goodness. A bad person is unconstrained. And so the point is both of these people will be enabled by AI, but the one who has the good behaviors and the bad behaviors at their disposal, if all of their capacity is amplified, the bad person is amplified more. So you can make the argument that this is built into markets. It is. We've seen it. You see ruthless behavior effectively evolving in our markets, but I think that AI is going to make it even worse. The second of these guaranteed scenarios is a break from reality cognitively. That whether it is a form of insanity that emerges or it is just a simple inability to know what is true that paralyzes us, I think probably both of those are going to happen, that we are going to see a breakdown in cognitive function in light of AI. And I think it's already, even if you just look at the videos that, are being circulated on social media, it's a struggle to figure out which of those things actually happened. Mm-hmm. Right? I'm a biologist. I'm a mammologist. And I was looking at a video yesterday of a brown bear, a grizzly, with cubs on its back running across a shallow river. It's not a behavior I've seen. And I'm thinking, I'm at a loss here. It looks so fantastic that I think it can't be real. but maybe it is. And I still don't know. I think it probably is real. To the small extent I was able to check, I think it was actually footage. And for me, a mammologist, to look at that and not know that I'm being informed of something that happens in nature that is squarely in my discipline is an amazing fact. So that's going to happen to us more and more. A lot of things, let's say that there's an Epstein video library. You're not going to know if it emerges a year and a half from now. You're not going to know which of those things were added in order to damage political rivals and which of those things actually were filmed. You just won't be able to know. So that's an incredibly troubling thing. And then just to complete the list is the economic disruption that is going to come in the form of not just AI, but if you take AI and humanoid robots, then there is in principle no job that can't be replaced ultimately. And so anyway, I see a lot of ways this can go wrong. I do see things that AI can do that we can't do without it. So there's hope, but my guess is we're going to lean into this sort of religion that we have that technological progress is inherently good, and we are just going to suffer massive unintended consequences. And, if we're lucky, we'll survive it.
Well, let's look at the economic disruption part. I believe it's 70 to 80% of jobs here in the West are service sector based, and that is supposed to be what is at least initially disproportionately affected by automation in these LLMs. Have you thought about whether or not the consequences will be greater for the West, who is already struggling with this cultural schizophrenia? What will the effects be, do you think, across in terms of geopolitically, if we're looking at more developed, technologically advanced societies versus ones that are still, it might be a while before they can create a robot that can pick fruit, or, that can do these more seemingly rudimentary tasks, but one that are a bit more blue collar. Do you think we'll be disproportionately affected by this, and will that usher in this era of UBI?
Yeah, I think, and it's not even UBI. At the beginning of the pandemic, which was only a pandemic because they redefined that term, but at the beginning of the so-called pandemic, there was a lot of concern about Africa because the structures necessary to protect the population were less well developed. But of course, Africa suffered less than any other continent. Why is that? Because the structures didn't exist and the pandemic was largely synthetic. I think the thing you're pointing to is exactly that hazard writ large with AI. That in effect, the more dependent on this fragile architecture we already are, the worse the consequences of AI are likely to be. And yes, I see every possibility that people will not have a viable plan to retool for the post-AI world that will make them require public assistance to persist, which will put them at the mercy of the structures that control the public apparatus. So, yeah, UBI will likely be a part of that, but so will central bank digital currencies, which then create a control architecture in which, your ability to fight back and go for a hike, even if they tell you not to, vanishes because your ability to procure the food substances that you need to survive will be cut off if you don't comply. So it creates an entirely new reason to think very carefully about how to prepare so that you don't end up under the control of these structures that seem hell-bent on collecting it for whatever reason.
And then I guess the next question would be, well, what is the point in having these quote unquote useless eaters around if all they're doing is consuming resources and not contributing anything meaningfully, if they have no labor that can be exploited, and if we can't use them as batteries like they do in the Matrix? I know you have some thoughts about that and how implausible it is. What then do they do with us, I guess, is the question, when we become obsolete? And, I say tongue-in-cheek, the proverbial they, because I don't know who they are, but I just presume a secret group of, various connections and alliances, maybe nothing official, but just the group of people who effectively are the movers and shakers financially of the world decide, well, what's the point? Should we encourage people to have less children because we're not going to need them? Or, are we just going to be their gene pool? If they need to, there's so many sci-fi films about how, they keep people around because they might need an organ replacement or something, or they might, need the genetic variants. What are your thoughts on, do they keep us around?
Yeah, I mean, I think your question answers itself. Of course they don't, and they will come up with mechanisms and rationalizations, and it won't be like any of the prior times, but it will belong on the same list.
What do you think the resistance is going to be, and or will there be any, because we've become so docile and compartmentalized?
Well, I would argue the following thing. I think COVID constitutes the best chance for us to understand the system that has been built up around us, the turnkey totalitarian state, and that everybody wants to move on from COVID. Nobody wants to think about it anymore. I get it, but we have no choice. This isn't about COVID. This is about making sure that whatever that structure is, we destroy it so it doesn't happen again. And if we don't, it will happen again. So I and a number of other people believe that our top priority has to be getting to the bottom of COVID. We have to understand what that was and how it unfolded the way it did, even if we can't punish the people who did it. Simply understanding what it was so that we can protect ourselves from it ever happening again is essential. And if we don't do that, then it's going to happen in some other form. It may have nothing to do with a virus, but the same instinct to lock us down and force us into accepting medical technologies, those things are clearly on the drawing board. The World Health Organization has pursued the power to declare emergencies at its sole discretion, to mandate medical technologies, including shots, to redistribute drugs as they see fit. These things are now in motion at the UN. So something wants that power, and it wants it for reasons that we don't know. And I think we have to find out urgently.
Do you think that, I know you tend to avoid political conversations, and so don't take this question the wrong way, but do you think the current administration is potentially putting up a real resistance, or is it more just a fabrication and theater to kind of appease the subset of his voting base that may want answers to those things? Like, I'm talking about the RFK type stuff. Is that really contributing significantly to change? I guess it's better than nothing, but is it really going to make a difference, do you think?
Well, it's already making a difference. Is it durable? I don't know. Does it go far enough? I'm almost sure it won't. but maybe it's the beginning of something that does. I think in the U.S., the Democrats did us a huge favor in one sense because they ran first a non-compos mentis president for a second term and then swapped in an empty suit. And so it was very clear that there was only one viable choice on the ballot. There was only one actual person you could vote for. If you voted for Kamala Harris, you were voting for the DNC, which is opaque and not accountable, and that's unconstitutional. The DNC doesn't get to be president. So I say they did us a favor because I don't worry that I made the wrong choice because I only had one choice. On the other hand, I do scratch my head over the failure of the Trump administration to capitalize on its moment as fully as I think it could have. I don't know why that happened. I don't know, presumably the control architectures that you and I can see with respect to our own lives have some analog with respect to things like presidents. The hope was that Trump was the enemy of those structures and that he was ready to go after them, which hasn't happened at the level I would have hoped. So I guess what I'm saying is I really don't know the answer to the question, but given what the alternative was, it was the only choice we had and we took it.
One thing I haven't heard you talk often about, and you talked about how one of the, I believe it was the third one you listed, bad people leveraging AI for nefarious ends. I haven't heard you talk much about how AI relates with war and how it could be leveraged for the purpose of war. I'm sure you're familiar with Palantir and its capabilities in terms of basically bringing together and integrating all the information on the battle space and making decisions, highly efficient decisions in real time about, effectively replacing generals and decision makers on the battlefield. But not only how it could be potentially weaponized in that respect, but obviously weaponized against us. I think I always hear people talking about, dislocation in the workforce. But for me personally, I suspect that one of the biggest impacts AI is going to be in the arms race in terms of automating the battlefield and potentially this arms race between nation states. And how it is potentially we're in this competition to build the next nuclear weapon of sorts. And that is wrought with all sorts of risks in terms of just haphazardly doing things that we don't know what the consequences are going to be, as the unintended consequences, as you often refer to it. Have you thought a lot about how AI factors into that geostrategic calculus in terms of war and war between nation states?
A lot. I don't think we can say anything specific, but I think effectively it's check and mate. Those who are willing to leverage this to hoard power will have ultimately an absolute advantage over the rest of us. You and I can't resist in a world where drones can be enabled to recognize our faces and to hunt us down in swarms. How are you going to resist? I mean, okay, there are caves. There are masks. Can it recognize your gait? Oh, okay. So you're going to have to mask your gait, not just your face. So anyway, the point is this very quickly becomes you're an enemy of the state because of whatever, and we have a right to end you to protect ourselves, and your move. In such a world, people will very quickly take on the beliefs of the power structure in order not to be exterminated. It's perfectly predictable. So what we should be doing is figuring out how, with the clock ticking, we can put aside our instinct to settle conflicts in a technologically enabled version of the same thing that chimps do. Right? That's effectively what we've got, is chimp-like instincts scaled up to a population of billions with a technological leverage that allows us to kill remotely, allows us, frankly, to program a drone to autonomously kill on our behalf while we're playing golf. So that's not a world that we can live in. The public should recognize that that's coming. All of the things I'm describing are readily possible. The game theory of it isn't unclear. So in light of that, what we ought to be doing is demanding of our governments that they figure out how to sideline this violent mode of conflict resolution before it comes down to a winner-take-all slaughter-bot kind of scenario.
If you had to speculate a time frame for when some of these events might culminate, be it a noticeable like flashpoint in terms of whether any of those five, have you thought about, how much time we have before this reaches a breaking point?
Well, sure, but the basic point is we crossed the event horizon already, which means I can't predict it with any sort of precision. I don't think anybody else can either. But the trajectory is clear enough. So that's all I need to know. The clock is ticking. Won't be, we can already take the test case of video that is false and undetectably so. All right. We're already staring down the barrel of that. We know that, we've watched drones leveraged in Ukraine, hunting down soldiers. We know that drone swarms are readily programmable. So anyway, all of this stuff is just a question of, well, do you really think that nobody is going to combine drone swarms with facial and gait recognition and political murder? I don't see how it could not happen. It's just a question of when. So in light of that, we have to, we effectively need some sort of a understanding of a new set of constitutional rights, right? The founders did not think to protect you from drone swarms. I can't imagine how they missed it, but somehow they didn't realize that was going to be an issue, right? So we need a digital Bill of Rights. We need a constitution that protects us from the powerful leveraging technology in order to first render us totally compliant, and then upon discovering that we are now useless eaters, medicate us out of existence, or whatever they will choose to do.
And that, just for clarification, that event horizon for you was the advent of LLMs when it pertains to AI?
Well, yeah, the event horizon is the LLM. I don't think that a talking computer is in and of itself. It's the step onto the slippery slope that causes you to end up down at the bottom of it. But yes, that's where the event horizon happened.
I've heard you talk before about how you think that things are speeding up and that technological progress is accelerating. I'm wondering if you're familiar with the Terence McKenna time wave zero hypothesis.
Not by that name. Maybe if you reminded me of it, it would click.
It's basically this idea that the universe is moving towards a point of novelty, infinite novelty, and that novelty increases with technological innovations to the point where you have some sort of emergent transformative event. I believe he called it what did he call it? It was the eschaton, or it was like the singularity, I suppose, is what, comes to mind. But that this novelty becomes so overwhelming for people, and it reaches a point in the future where there's more change in a day than there was in the previous 10 years. And at that point, we just can't make sense of the world. Our biology is completely inept when it comes to navigating such a world.
Well, I have two disagreements with at least the way you've presented it, and maybe it's just a language issue.
Yeah.
One is, I don't see any reason to think this is happening to the universe, but our universe, the human universe, maybe.
Right. I think that's what he meant.
Yeah, I figured. The second thing, though, is I don't think we get to a place where there's more change in a day than in the previous 10 years, because I don't think it's stable anywhere near that rate. In other words, catastrophe will set in way sooner than that. But yes, the process that you're describing is not at all unlike what Heather and I describe as hypernovelty.
Hypernovelty. Okay. And so that is this idea that there is just more and more variance in human technological endeavors, and that is something that we're not biologically ready for.
Well, again, if I can remind you where we started, humans are the most capable creature that has ever existed with respect to our ability to adapt to change. It's what we do. But there is a rate above which we can't do it. And we can't do it at the level of what you're calling our biology, our wet biology, right? Our physiology. We are eating the wrong stuff. It's bad for our health, right? It's making us sick. But our cognitive biology is equally vulnerable on a different timescale. It is, I think, clearly true that if your developmental environment, the world in which you are a child, is not a sufficiently good match for the world in which you are an adult, you will suffer from a pathology of that mismatch. But we aren't even there, right? The world I live in as an adult is definitely not one that I trained for as a child, for sure. But my world has also been revolutionized several different times, right? It was revolutionized by the computer, and then by the internet, and then by the smartphone, and now by LLMs. That's way too many revolutions for one life. At most, you can deal with one. And I think, frankly, the pattern we see with soldiers and PTSD is very telling. A person can go from a calm suburban life to a life and death struggle on a foreign battlefield, and they can figure it out. But when they come home, a lot of them can't figure out a second transition of that magnitude, right? One transition is about what a human being can handle. And you revolutionize life twice, and suddenly you don't know how to unlearn the lesson of the battlefield while you're shopping at Safeway, because you need milk at home. So I think we're in this situation. I think you can, it's not good for you, but you can adapt to a radical change in life. But you can't adapt to a pattern of radical change where you just don't know what amazing thing is going to take everything you thought was true and render it useless. Anytime you see them target your rights, you should be alarmed and you should fight it. Your kids and your grandkids are going to regret it if you don't protect those things with everything you got. Once you realize the inmates are running the asylum, prepping makes a lot more sense.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.